Hey guys, tonight we begin with blood, with a baby who never asked to be king, with a queen who led armies while her husband stared at walls, with 30 years of cousins murdering cousins over a crown that destroyed everyone who wore it. Before we dive in, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. In 1422, England's greatest warrior king died of dysentery, not in glorious combat, not leading a charge, sitting on a toilet in France at 35 years old, his bowels turning to liquid, his legendary body failing him in the most humiliating way possible. He left behind a 9-month-old baby to inherit 2 kingdoms, a military legacy impossible to match, and a nobility that would spend the next 40 years tearing England apart, arguing about who should really be in charge. That baby would grow up to go violently insane. His wife would command armies while he sang hymns in a tent during battles. His own cousin would declare him unfit, steal his throne, and put his head on a spike, metaphorically first, then literally for his father. And England would descend into a 30-year bloodbath so personal, so brutal, so utterly devoid of chivalry that families would murder their own children to prevent them from claiming crowns 30 years later. But here's what they don't teach you in history class. Lancaster didn't start this war. They were the rightful kings, crowned, anointed, recognised by every Christian kingdom in Europe, legitimate by every measure that mattered in the 15th century. York decided bloodlines mattered more than crowns. York decided that great-great-grandfather's claim from 100 years ago was more important than 3 generations of actual kingship. York raised armies against their anointed sovereign and called it justice, called it setting things right, called it anything except what it actually was: treason, ambition, and the systematic murder of everyone who stood between them and power. And tonight, we're telling this story the right way, from Lancaster's side, from the red rose that refused to die even when York crushed it into the mud, cut off its heads, and mounted them on spikes. From queens who fought like warriors, and kings who couldn't fight at all, from princes murdered as teenagers, and exiles who waited decades for revenge, from a dynasty that lost everything, and then, impossibly, won it all back. This is the story of how Lancaster survived, how they endured betrayal, exile, madness, and the murder of their heirs, how they watched York tear itself apart through its own ambition, and how in the end, a teenager with a questionable claim and a patient mother managed to kill the last York king and unite the roses forever. So settle in, this is going to take a while. Because the Wars of the Roses weren't a single war. They were 3 decades of betrayal, murder, and political chaos. 3 decades of battlefields soaked in English blood. 3 decades of queens begging foreign kings for armies. 3 decades of princes growing up in exile, learning to hate cousins they'd never met. And it all started with a baby in a cradle who had no idea he'd just inherited a nightmare. Picture Windsor Castle, 1422, late August. The stone walls are cold despite the summer heat. A baby wrapped in cloth of gold, fabric so expensive it could feed a village for a year. Squalls in a cradle carved from oak and inlaid with gems. He's 9 months old, can barely sit up without support, doesn't understand why all these strange men in elaborate robes keep bowing to him, and he's just become King of England and France. Congratulations, kid. Hope you like responsibility, because you've got about 40 million people depending on you, and you can't even control your own bladder yet. Henry VI never had a chance. His father, Henry V, the warrior king who'd made French nobles kneel at Agincourt, who'd forced the French crown to recognise English superiority, who'd been the living embodiment of medieval warrior kingship, was dead. Dysentery. the medieval killer that didn't care about your military genius or your legendary status. One contaminated meal, and the greatest military mind in Europe died screaming on a camp bed, shitting himself, while his physicians tried ineffective purges and his chaplains administered last rites. He left behind this baby, this helpless, innocent baby who'd grow up to be the worst King England ever crowned, who'd lose France, who'd lose his mind, who'd lose his throne, who'd watch his own son killed and then get murdered himself in a tower cell. But no one knew that yet. In 1422, everyone was optimistic. England had systems for this. Regency councils, experienced lords. Henry's uncles would govern until the boy came of age. Everything would be fine. Except Henry VI wasn't like his father, not even a little bit. Imagine being the toddler Henry. You're growing up surrounded by men who constantly talk about your father, the great Henry V, the warrior, the conqueror, the man who made France surrender. Every tutor, every courtier, every noble who visits court tells you stories about how magnificent your father was, how brave, how strong, how feared. And you? You're afraid of loud noises. You cry when you see blood, even just a hunting injury. You prefer praying to fighting. You'd rather read theological texts than learn swordplay. You're everything your father wasn't, and everyone notices. His father had been a warrior, ruthless, charismatic, the kind of king who could inspire men to march into hell because they believed he'd lead them back out victorious. Henry VI, Henry preferred prayer to politics, wore a hair shirt under his royal robes, rough cloth designed to mortify the flesh, to remind him of Christ's suffering. He recoiled from violence like it physically burned him. He'd rather discuss theology with monks than command armies. By the time he's 10, the courtiers are exchanging worried glances. By 15, they're actively concerned. By 20, they're terrified, because their king isn't just pious, he's disconnected from reality, from the responsibilities of kingship, from the brutal necessities of maintaining power in 15th century Europe. He'd spend hours in prayer, just kneeling, silent, lost in communion with God while his kingdom fell apart around him. He'd have episodes where he'd stop mid-conversation, just freeze. His eyes would go distant, his mouth would hang open slightly, and he'd be gone. Not physically, his body remained, but his mind had departed to somewhere courtiers couldn't follow. In another life, in another family, he'd have made an excellent priest, maybe even a saint, peaceful, scholarly, devoted to God and learning, kind to everyone he met, generous with the poor, everything a good Christian should be. But he wasn't a priest, he was a king. And in 15th century England, kings needed to inspire fear in their enemies and confidence in their supporters. They needed to make hard decisions, execute traitors, lead armies, negotiate from positions of strength. Henry inspired neither fear nor confidence. He just made people uncomfortable, made them wonder what was wrong with him, made them start looking around for alternatives. Today we might recognise severe mental illness, possibly inherited from his maternal grandfather, Charles VI of France, Charles the Mad, who'd once believed he was made of glass and would shatter if touched, who'd attacked his own knights during a psychotic episode, who'd spent the last decades of his reign barely functional while France tore itself apart. That blood ran in Henry's veins, and by the 1440s it was becoming clear that Henry had inherited more than just his grandfather's crown. He'd inherited his grandfather's fractured mind. But in 1440, he was still young, still functional enough to govern, if barely, still the anointed King of England, and the nobility, exhausted from decades of war with France, just wanted stability. They needed Henry to produce an heir, to secure the succession, to make sure the kingdom didn't descend into chaos when he died. So they found him a bride, Margaret of Anjou, a French princess, 15 years old, beautiful, intelligent, and completely unprepared for what awaited her in England. Margaret of Anjou was 15 when she arrived in England to marry a king she'd never met. She'd been raised at the French court, educated by tutors, taught to manage a household, play music, embroider, and pray. She knew she was marrying for politics. Her father, René of Anjou, had made that crystal clear. She was a political chess piece. A treaty sealed with a wedding. A promise that England and France might finally stop killing each other. But she was still 15, still hoping maybe this King of England would be handsome, strong, someone she could at least respect if not love. Someone who'd make this bearable. Imagine being her. You've sailed across the channel. Sick the entire time because the sea is rough and medieval ships are basically wooden boxes that leak. You arrive in England, cold, grey, raining, everything your French relatives warned you about. You're escorted to Windsor Castle, presented to Henry VI, and he's praying, kneeling at his private altar. Doesn't look up when you enter, just keeps murmuring his devotions. His chamberlain coughs again, finally touches Henry's shoulder, and Henry startles like he's been struck. Looks around confused, takes a moment to remember where he is, who you are, why you're here. When he finally focuses on you, he smiles. It's a gentle smile, kind, the smile of a man who genuinely wants everyone to be happy. But it's also completely disconnected, like he's smiling at a pleasant dream rather than his future wife. "You're very beautiful," he says. His voice is soft, cultured. "God has blessed us both with this union. We shall pray together. Often, would you like that? This is your husband. This is the man whose bed you'll share, whose heirs you'll bear, whose kingdom you'll help rule." And he's already half gone, already more concerned with salvation than kingship, already lost in a spiritual world that doesn't include practical matters like governance or military strategy or producing children. Margaret spent her first years trying to be a good medieval wife, submissive, supportive, invisible when necessary. She attended court functions, smiled at the right moments, dressed magnificently to impress visiting dignitaries, tried to give Henry advice gently, carefully, without seeming to usurp his authority. But by 1448, with France completely lost, all those territories Henry V had conquered, just handed back in humiliating peace treaties that made England look weak, and Henry, increasingly unable to govern, Margaret realised something crucial, something that would define the rest of her life. If she didn't take control, Richard of York would. And York didn't just want power. York wanted her husband's crown. York believed his bloodline was superior, that Lancaster had no right to rule, that the throne should belong to him. Margaret couldn't let that happen, because she'd made vows, sacred vows before God, to honour her husband, to support his reign, to protect his crown. She took those vows seriously, more seriously than Henry took his own kingship. And then came 1453, the year everything changed, the year Margaret discovered she was pregnant, after 8 years of marriage, 8 years of whispers behind her back, 8 years of courtiers exchanging knowing looks and speculating that maybe she was barren, maybe God was punishing England for something, maybe the marriage was cursed, 8 years of shame and doubt and desperate prayers. Finally, an heir, a Lancastrian prince who would secure the succession and make York's bloodline irrelevant, make all his scheming pointless, make his claim to superior bloodlines laughable because Lancaster would have a direct heir. Everything depended on that pregnancy. Everything. Margaret retreated to Windsor, surrounded herself with loyal guards, hired the best midwives, prayed constantly, ate carefully, did everything medieval medicine recommended for ensuring a healthy birth. And in October 1453, she gave birth to a healthy son, Edward of Westminster, Prince of Wales, the future King of England. A beautiful, perfect baby boy who represented everything Lancaster needed. Margaret held her son, this tiny, squalling infant who had no idea his existence had just changed English politics, and allowed herself for one moment to believe they'd won. That York was finished, that her son would grow up to be the king his grandfather should have been, that the nightmare was over. And then someone told her about Henry, about what had happened in August, 2 months before the birth, how the king had just stopped. August 1453, a hunting lodge in Wiltshire. Henry's having a good day, or at least what passes for a good day for him. He's with his councillors discussing some tedious land dispute. Some minor noble claiming another minor noble stole his sheep or encroached on his property, or something equally boring. Henry's listening, actually listening, nodding occasionally. He's about to render judgment, something diplomatic that will make neither party happy but prevent actual violence, when he stops, mid-sentence. His mouth stays open, his eyes don't blink. He's frozen, like someone carved a statue of a man speaking and placed it in the king's chair. The councillors wait, think maybe he's thinking, considering his words carefully. Henry does that sometimes, goes silent for long periods. But this is different. His eyes are open, but they're not seeing anything. They're fixed on nothing, empty. One of the councillors coughs, nothing. Another speaks, "Your Grace, nothing." They stand, approach carefully. "Your Grace, are you well?" One of them touches Henry's shoulder. No response. Henry's breathing, his heart's beating, but he's not there. Not in any meaningful sense. It's like his soul just departed, leaving his body behind as an empty shell. They carry him to his chambers, lay him on the bed, call physicians. The doctors try everything they know. Bloodletting, cutting his arms to release bad humours, purges, making him drink concoctions designed to clear his system. They check his urine, its colour, its smell, its consistency. All the medieval diagnostic tools that amount to medieval doctors having no idea what's actually wrong. Nothing works, weeks pass, then months. The king remains catatonic, doesn't speak, doesn't recognise people. When attendants move his arms, he doesn't resist, doesn't help, just allows himself to be positioned like a doll. They feed him by hand, spoon broth into his mouth. Sometimes he swallows, sometimes it just dribbles down his chin. Imagine being one of Henry's attendants. You've served him for years, watched him pray, listened to his gentle voice. Now you're responsible for keeping him alive while his mind is somewhere else. You wash him, change his clothes, clean up when he loses control of his bodily functions, because his body still needs to eat and eliminate even if his mind is gone. You talk to him sometimes. Tell him about what's happening in the kingdom, about his wife, about the son he doesn't know he has. And he just stares, doesn't react, doesn't acknowledge you exist. It's like talking to furniture. Except furniture doesn't occasionally make this low moaning sound that might be distress or might be nothing. It's the saddest thing you've ever witnessed. The King of England, reduced to this, and you can't help wondering if he's still in there somewhere, trapped, screaming inside his own head while his body refuses to respond. Or if he's somewhere peaceful, somewhere his fractured mind can finally rest. You don't know which would be worse. Margaret tried to maintain control. She'd just given birth. Her body was still recovering. She was exhausted, hormonal, terrified, and now she had to defend her husband's crown while he was completely incapacitated. She argued that she should be granted the regency. She was the queen, the mother of the heir. She'd been involved in government for years. She understood the issues. She could govern in Henry's name until he recovered. But England in 1453 wasn't ready for a woman to rule. The nobility exchanged glances, made diplomatic noises about how much they valued Her Grace's counsel, then promptly ignored her and started debating which nobleman should be granted power. The name that kept coming up, Richard, Duke of York, Henry's cousin, the man with the impressive bloodline, the man who'd been building support for years, the man who'd been very, very careful to present himself as the loyal cousin who just wanted to serve his king. Margaret fought it, screamed, protested, wrote letters to every lord she thought might support her. She had the legitimate heir. She was the Queen. York was just a cousin with ambitions, but she lost. York was named Lord Protector in March 1454, temporary regent, ruler of England in the King's absence. And just like that, the House of York was in control of England, legally, officially, with the full backing of Parliament. Margaret retreated to her chambers with her infant son, Edward, the boy who should have secured Lancaster's future, who instead was just another piece in a game being played by men who thought women's only role was to produce heirs and stay quiet. She held Edward, 4 months old now, starting to smile, completely oblivious to the political chaos surrounding him, and made plans, because she knew something York didn't. Henry was getting better. It happened gradually. First he started responding to sounds. A door slamming would make him flinch. Footsteps would make his eyes track movement. Then he began recognizing faces. His chamberlain, his confessor, his wife. His eyes would follow them. A spark of recognition. Brief, but there. Then came words, single words at first. Yes, no, cold, like a child learning to speak. Then sentences, halting, confused. Where am I? How long? But sentences nonetheless. By Christmas 1454, 15 months after his breakdown, Henry VI was functional again, not fully recovered. He'd always be fragile now, always prone to episodes, always at risk of descending back into that catatonic state. But he could speak, could recognise his wife and his counsellors, could perform the basic duties of kingship. And Margaret moved immediately. She knew she had a limited window, before York could consolidate his power too thoroughly, before the nobility got comfortable with York running things, before people started seriously considering whether England might be better off with a different king entirely. She gathered her supporters, nobles who'd always been loyal to Lancaster, who remembered their oaths to Henry, who distrusted York's ambitions. She presented the king with his son. Henry had been catatonic when Edward was born, and had no memory of the child. Watching Henry hold his son for the first time was heartbreaking. Henry cried, gentle tears running down his face. God has blessed us, he whispered. Our son, our beautiful son, Edward, Prince of Wales. For a moment, Margaret allowed herself hope. Maybe this would change things. Maybe fatherhood would give Henry strength, purpose. Maybe he'd finally become the king England needed. That hope lasted about 3 days. Then Henry went back to his prayers, back to his gentle disconnection from reality. He was better than he'd been, but he'd never be what England needed, never be strong enough to hold on to power against someone like York. But he was functional, and that was enough. Margaret had him dismiss York from the protectorship, strip him of his offices, remove him from power. All that carefully built influence, gone. All those months of governing, erased. York went from ruling England to being politically irrelevant in a matter of weeks. All because a king had woken up from his madness. And because his queen was smart enough to act fast, York could have accepted it, could have retreated to his estates, bided his time, waited for another opportunity, been patient. But York wasn't patient. York was proud, and he'd tasted power, had ruled England, had been one step away from claiming the throne when Henry inconveniently woke up. He wasn't going back to being just another cousin. So York did the one thing that made reconciliation impossible. The one thing that would start a war. Neither side wanted, but both sides would fight to the finish. He raised an army and marched on London, May 1455, spring. The kind of English spring where it's sunny one moment and pouring rain the next. The roads are muddy, everything smells like wet wool and horse manure. And 2 armies are about to turn a quiet market town into a slaughterhouse. St Albans, a small town just north of London. The kind of place where the most exciting thing that usually happens is a dispute over the price of grain at market, where people know their neighbours, where violence means a tavern fight on Saturday night, not nobles killing each other in the streets. The royal army positioned itself in the town, blocking York's path to London. The king was with them, Henry, still fragile but present, probably praying in his tent while his commanders positioned forces. His banner was flying, the royal standard, the anointed sovereign facing down a rebellious cousin. This should have ended with York kneeling, begging forgiveness, accepting exile or imprisonment, anything except open warfare against his king. York had been negotiating, sending messages to the king, demanding a place at court, the removal of certain councillors, Margaret's supporters naturally, recognition of his rightful influence as the king's cousin and loyal servant. The royal forces had refused, made it clear York would not be allowed to dictate terms, that marching an army toward London was treason, that this would end badly for him unless he surrendered immediately. And so, on May 22nd, 1455, York's forces attacked. Picture being a common soldier in that battle. You're from Kent, you farm sheep, you have a wife and 3 children. You don't care about bloodlines or royal politics. You're here because your lord commanded it. Because refusing meant losing your farm. Because this is just what happens when nobles decide to fight. You're standing in a narrow street, houses on both sides, barely room to swing a weapon. You can smell bread baking somewhere, some baker who's determined to complete his work despite the battle. Or maybe he just doesn't care. Maybe after decades of noble warfare, people have learned to just keep living while their betters kill each other. Someone screams. The Yorkist forces are pushing forward. You raise your pike. The man next to you is praying. Loud, crying. He's never been in combat before, neither have you. Training with wooden weapons in a field is different from this. From the screaming, from the smell of blood and shit because men lose control of their bowels when they're terrified. The fighting starts. It's not like songs, not honourable or glorious. It's chaos. Men slipping in mud and blood. Someone falls in front of you. Friend or enemy? Can't tell. They're wearing armour, covered in mud. You step over them, keep moving, because stopping means dying. The battle lasted a few hours. Maybe, it's hard to call it a proper battle, more of a violent disagreement. That got out of hand. A skirmish that spiralled into something darker. But when it was over, the bodies in the streets told a story. Edmund Beaufort, Duke of Somerset, one of Lancaster's most important supporters, one of the king's closest allies, one of the few men Margaret trusted completely, dead in the street, cut down by York's soldiers, his blood running between cobblestones, his body stripped for valuables by soldiers who didn't care about his rank. Henry Percy, Earl of Northumberland, dead. Thomas Clifford, Lord Clifford, dead. A dozen other Lancastrian nobles, dead or dying. And Henry? They found him sitting under an oak tree, arrow wound in his neck. Not deep enough to be fatal, but bleeding steadily. Dazed, confused, helpless, York knelt before him, mud on his knees, blood on his armour, someone else's blood. He swore loyalty, kissed the king's hand, said he'd never meant to harm the king, that this was all Somerset's fault, that evil counsellors had led the king astray, that if Henry would just listen to reason, everything could be resolved peacefully. Henry, wounded and exhausted, and probably halfway dissociated from reality, agreed to everything. Just nodded, said yes, whatever York wanted. Henry just wanted the violence to stop. York escorted him back to London, had him issue proclamations confirming York as his loyal servant, had Parliament reinstate York as Lord Protector. Within days, York was back in power, legally, legitimately, with the king's blessing. It looked like York had won, bloodlessly, or bloodlessly enough. The king was under his control. The kingdom was his to govern. Margaret's supporters were dead. Everything had worked exactly as planned. But Margaret wasn't in St Albans during the battle. She'd been kept away, safe with her son, and she watched, from London, from reports, from terrified messengers, as York seized control of her husband through violence and intimidation. As York murdered Lancaster's supporters and called it politics. As York raised arms against his anointed king and Parliament just accepted it. Margaret understood with absolute clarity that this wasn't over, that York would keep pushing, keep demanding, keep using Henry's weakness to consolidate power until there was nothing left of Lancaster except a crown without authority, a king without power, a dynasty waiting to be erased. She wasn't going to let that happen, because Margaret of Anjou wasn't just a queen anymore. She was a mother. Her son's inheritance was at stake, and she would fight for Edward's birthright with everything she had. Even if it meant war, even if it meant blood, even if it meant turning England into a battlefield. Because Lancaster was the rightful royal house. Henry was the anointed king. Edward was the legitimate heir. And York? York was a traitor, a rebel, a man who'd raised arms against his king and murdered loyal servants of the crown. And traitors eventually got what they deserved. York's second protectorship was different from his first, shorter, more contested. Margaret had learned from her mistakes. She worked quietly, building alliances, cultivating support among nobles who distrusted York, making it clear that York's ambitions threatened everyone's stability, not just Lancaster's. By early 1456, Henry had recovered enough to dismiss York again. Margaret ensured it, had the right people whisper the right words in Henry's ear, made sure Parliament understood that the king, the actual anointed king, wanted York removed from power. York retreated to his estates, again, seething, building support, waiting. But this time was different, because this time York's son was getting involved. Edward of York, the Earl of March, 19 years old, tall over 6 feet, which made him literally look down on most men. Handsome in a way that made women stare and men instinctively defer. Charismatic. A natural warrior who moved like violence was his first language. He'd been watching his father get outmaneuvered by Margaret. Watched the old man try to work within the system. Try to be patient. Try to use politics and parliament and negotiation. And Edward had decided that maybe politics wasn't the path to power. Maybe war was. Maybe the way to beat Lancaster wasn't through careful manoeuvring, but through crushing them so completely they could never rise again. For 3 years England existed in Cold War. York held his estates and built his army. Margaret consolidated power around the king. Both sides knew another confrontation was coming. Both sides prepared. Both sides recruited allies and stockpiled weapons and trained soldiers and waited for the other side to make a mistake. The nobility split. Some supported Lancaster out of loyalty to the crowned king, out of belief that oaths mattered, that the anointed sovereign deserved obedience regardless of his mental state. Some supported York because they believed in his bloodline claim, because they thought Lancaster had usurped the throne from Richard II back in 1399, and it was time to correct that injustice. But most just wanted stability. Most were exhausted from decades of war with France, from high taxes and political chaos, and kings who couldn't hold their kingdoms together. They picked whichever side seemed strongest, whichever side seemed most likely to win. Because in the Wars of the Roses, being on the losing side meant execution, meant your lands confiscated, meant your family destroyed. It wasn't about justice anymore. It wasn't about right or wrong or legitimate claims. It was about survival, about choosing sides before the fighting started and hoping you picked the winner. September 1459, Blore Heath. York's forces clashed with the Lancastrian army. The battle was fierce, men died in droves, but York won. Scattered the Lancastrians, proved he could win battles when it mattered. But then came October 1459, Ludford Bridge. The royal army confronted York directly. Henry's banner was flying. The king himself was present, and York's supporters looked at that royal standard, the anointed sovereign's banner, and hesitated. Some deserted outright, others just laid down their weapons. Because however much they supported York's cause, however much they believed in his bloodline claim, shooting arrows at the anointed king was still treason, still unthinkable, still a sin that would damn their souls to hell. York fled, ran to Ireland with his tail between his legs. His son Edward fled to Calais. The rebellion collapsed. Parliament declared York and his supporters traitors, stripped them of their lands and titles, sentenced them to death if captured. Margaret had won. Again. For the third time, she'd outmaneuvered York. The threat was neutralised. The traitors were in exile. The king was secure. The succession was safe. Everything was fine. Except Edward of York was still alive, still building support in Calais, still planning, still recruiting, still training soldiers, still waiting for his moment. And in June 1460, he invaded. Edward of York landed at Sandwich on June 26, 1460. He came with an army from Calais, professional soldiers, mercenaries, men who fought for pay rather than loyalty. And he came with a message carefully crafted to appeal to the exhausted English nobility. He wasn't rebelling against King Henry. He loved King Henry, respected King Henry, would never raise arms against his anointed sovereign. No, Edward was rescuing King Henry from evil counsellors, from Margaret, from the French queen who'd corrupted England's government, from the she-wolf who controlled the king and was destroying the kingdom. It was brilliant propaganda, the same excuse rebels had used for centuries. We're not fighting the king, we're saving the king from bad advisors. The king is good and pure and misled. Once we remove the corrupting influences, everything will be fine. And it worked. Because England was exhausted, tired of instability, tired of high taxes to fund wars they didn't understand, tired of a king who couldn't rule and a queen who ruled too much. Towns opened their gates to Edward. Lords joined his cause. The common people, desperate for change, saw a young warrior promising stability and cheered. By July, Edward's army was marching on London, and Margaret's forces were scrambling. They'd been caught off guard, hadn't expected an invasion so soon, hadn't anticipated that Edward would move so aggressively, so confidently, so decisively. They raised an army, gathered every loyal Lancastrian force they could, positioned themselves at Northampton to block Edward's path to London. They had defensive positions, trenches, fortifications. They had the king with them, Henry in the camp, probably praying while his commanders planned the battle. They should have won. July 10th, 1460. The Battle of Northampton. The Lancastrian forces were dug in, protected, had superior position. But one of the Lancastrian commanders, Lord Grey of Ruthin, had been negotiating with York, secretly, making deals, promising to switch sides at the crucial moment. And when Edward's army attacked, Grey ordered his men to stand down, let the Yorkists through the fortifications, open the door for the enemy. It was betrayal, pure and simple. The worst kind of treachery, not fighting an open battle, but selling out your own side. The Lancastrian lines collapsed. Men died trying to escape, drowned in rivers while wearing armour, cut down by Yorkist soldiers who'd been told to show no mercy. Edward of York walked into the royal tent and found King Henry VI sitting calmly at a small table as if waiting for dinner. Henry looked up, blinked, seemed surprised there was a battle happening. "Are you hurt, my lord?" he asked Edward. Genuinely concerned. No anger, no fear, no comprehension that he'd just been captured by rebels who'd killed hundreds of his supporters. Henry didn't resist, didn't protest, didn't demand anything, just accepted that he'd lost, again. Allowed himself to be escorted back to London, allowed himself to be placed under York's control, again. Because Henry wasn't capable of fighting for his own crown. He just wanted everyone to stop being violent, wanted peace, wanted to pray and be left alone. But Richard, Duke of York, wanted more than just the protectorship this time. More than just governing in Henry's name. More than just being the loyal cousin who served his king. York wanted the throne. October 1460. Richard, Duke of York, marched into the House of Lords, walked straight down the centre aisle, and sat on the throne. Not near it, not beside it, on the seat reserved for the king, for God's anointed, for the man who ruled by divine right. York sat on that throne like he owned it, because he believed he did. The Lords were stunned, silent. This wasn't how things worked. You didn't just claim the throne, even if your bloodline was strong, even if you had legitimate grievances. You didn't walk into Parliament and sit on the king's seat like you belonged there. But York did, and then he presented his claim, argued that his descent from Edward III was superior to Henry's, that his lineage, through both his mother and father, gave him a better right to the throne than the House of Lancaster. That Lancaster had usurped the throne from Richard II back in 1399. That the last 60 years of Lancastrian rule were fundamentally illegitimate. Parliament debated for weeks because York's claim had merit. His bloodline was strong, his descent from Edward III was legitimate and through both male and female lines. But so was Henry's claim. The House of Lancaster had ruled England for 3 generations. Henry was crowned, anointed, recognised by every foreign power, accepted by the church. You couldn't just unmake a king, could you? Where did you draw the line? If bloodlines from 100 years ago mattered more than current reality, then any nobleman with a complicated family tree could claim he deserved the throne. It was chaos, madness, a recipe for endless civil war. But York had an army, had control of London, had the king under his power. Parliament couldn't just ignore him, couldn't dismiss his claim, couldn't risk another battle. So they reached a compromise. The Act of Accord. Henry VI would remain king for his lifetime. He'd keep his crown, his dignity, his royal privileges. But after his death, the crown would pass to Richard, Duke of York, and his heirs, not to Edward of Westminster, not to Margaret's son. The legitimate Prince of Wales was disinherited, cut out of the succession entirely. 9 years old and already politically destroyed. It was a death sentence for the Lancastrian succession. Everything Margaret had fought for, securing her son's inheritance, protecting the dynasty, maintaining Lancaster's legitimacy, was erased. The House of Lancaster would end with Henry VI, and York would take the throne. Margaret wasn't in London when this happened. She was in the north, raising an army, because she'd seen this coming. The moment York sat on that throne, she knew negotiations were over. Compromise was impossible. This was about survival now, her son's survival. York had just declared that Edward of Westminster had no claim to the throne, that Margaret's son, her only child, the boy she'd fought for, prayed for, protected for 9 years, was irrelevant, illegitimate, worthless. When Henry died, York would take the crown, and the Lancastrian line would end. Margaret wasn't going to accept that, not while she had breath in her body, not while she could raise an army, not while there were lords still loyal to the crowned king. So she gathered forces in the north, sent messages to Scotland, to France, to anyone who would support the Lancastrian cause. She promised lands, titles, anything to build an army strong enough to crush York. And by December 1460, she had one. Thousands of men, northern lords who remembered their oaths to Henry VI, common soldiers who'd been promised plunder, Scottish mercenaries who'd been told they could keep whatever English land they took. A ragged, desperate, dangerous army, but an army nonetheless. York heard about Margaret's forces, and he made a fatal mistake. The last mistake he'd ever make. He decided to march north with a small force and crush the rebellion before it could threaten London. Before Margaret could gather more support, before this got out of hand. He took a few thousand men, marched through a December snowstorm, and on December 30th, 1460, arrived at his castle of Sandal near Wakefield. He should have stayed inside, should have waited for reinforcements, should have recognised that Margaret's army vastly outnumbered his. But York was impatient, arrogant, confident. He'd beaten Lancaster before. He'd do it again. On December 30th, York's army left the castle, met Margaret's forces in open battle, and was destroyed. December 30th, 1460, Yorkshire. The snow has been falling for days, heavy, wet snow that soaks through everything, the kind that makes you lose your bearings, that turns the world into a white nightmare where you can't tell sky from ground. Richard, Duke of York, was at his castle of Sandal near Wakefield, safe, warm, protected by stone walls and loyal guards. He'd marched north to deal with Margaret's rebellion, to crush it quickly before it became a real threat. But his scouts had reported back. The Lancastrian forces were massive, 3 times his number, maybe 4 times. Margaret had gathered every man she could find. The smart move was obvious. Stay in the castle, wait for reinforcements, let Margaret's army starve in the snow while he stayed comfortable. Winter was on his side, and time was on his side. Patience would win this. But York wasn't patient. York was 50 years old. He'd been playing political games his entire life. He'd tasted power, been protector 3 times, sat on the throne and claimed it as his own. He was 1 step from the crown. And now this French woman, this upstart queen who'd married a mad king, thought she could threaten him? Thought she could raise an army and make him wait? Make him look like a coward hiding in his castle? No. York would ride out, crush her forces, show England who the real power was. Imagine being one of York's commanders. You're looking at the scouts' reports. You're looking at the numbers. You know this is suicide. You try to tell York. Gently, carefully. Your Grace, perhaps we should wait for reinforcements. The Earl of... York cuts you off. I've beaten Lancaster before. I'll do it again. We ride out tomorrow. You want to argue. Want to make him see reason. But he's the Duke. He's your lord. You've sworn oaths. And maybe, just maybe, he knows something you don't. Maybe he's right. Maybe Lancaster will break easily. You swallow your objections and prepare for battle. December 30th, morning. The snow is still falling. York's army marches out of Sandal Castle, a few thousand men, moving through snow that's knee-deep in places. Visibility is terrible. You can barely see 50 feet ahead. The cold is brutal. Men are already shivering despite their armour. You march toward where the scouts said the Lancastrian army was positioned, and then you see them. Shapes in the snow. Banners, lots of banners, more than expected. The army is massive, stretching further than you can see. Thousands of men, and they're moving toward you. Too late to retreat, too late to run back to the castle. You're committed. York's forces form up, defensive position, wait for the Lancastrians to attack. Maybe they'll break themselves against your lines. Maybe the Lancastrians hit like a hammer. Overwhelming force from the front, and then more force from the side. They've surrounded you, cut off your retreat. This isn't a battle. This is an execution. You're fighting now, desperate, brutal, men, packed so tight you can barely move. Someone screams. You can't tell if it's friendly or enemy. Your sword hits something. Armour keeps hitting. Again, until something cracks and the person goes down. You step over them, keep fighting, because there's nothing else to do. Somewhere ahead, Richard, Duke of York, is still fighting. Still shouting orders no one can hear over the chaos. His bodyguards are trying to protect him, forming a circle, shields up, weapons out. But there are too many Lancastrians. They keep coming, wave after wave, pushing, pressing, breaking through, and then York is down. Maybe he slipped in the blood-soaked snow. Maybe someone got a lucky strike past his guard. Maybe his bodyguards failed for just 1 second. It doesn't matter. He's down, and the Lancastrians are on him. Multiple blades, multiple men, all striking. York tries to rise, can't. His armour is good, but not good enough. The blades find gaps, joints, weak points. York is screaming, not words, just sound, raw, primal, the sound every man makes when they know they're dying. And then he's not screaming anymore. Then he's still. The Battle of Wakefield is a slaughter. York's army is destroyed. Those who can flee do. The rest die in the snow. Hundreds of bodies, maybe thousands. It's hard to count when they're all covered in snow and blood, frozen together in death. But Margaret's soldiers aren't done, because this isn't just war. This is revenge. For St Albans, for the lords York killed, for the years of treachery and rebellion. They find York's body after the battle, strip it, take his armour as prizes, his weapons, his rings, everything valuable. And someone, history doesn't record who, has an idea. They take York's head, cut it off right there on the battlefield, blood steaming in the cold air, and someone makes a paper crown. Crude thing. Just folded paper, nothing fancy, and they put it on York's severed head. Look at the king now. Look at the man who thought bloodlines mattered more than crowns. Look at the pretender who dared claim the throne. This is what happens to traitors. This is what happens when you raise arms against your anointed king. They mount York's head on a spike above the gates of York City, his own city, named after his family, and they leave it there for weeks, through snow and rain and freezing wind. The paper crown dissolves in the first rain, but the head remains, flesh rotting, birds pecking at it, a warning to anyone who thought they could challenge Lancaster. But the Yorkists found something else on that battlefield, something that would make them fight even harder. York's second son, Edmund, Earl of Rutland, 17 years old. A boy really. He'd fought in the battle, tried to be brave, tried to prove himself. When the line broke, when York's forces started fleeing, Edmund ran too. He made it to Wakefield Bridge, almost escaped, almost got away, but John Clifford caught him there. Clifford, a Lancastrian lord whose father had died at St Albans, who'd spent 5 years waiting for revenge, who'd dreamed about this moment, about making York's family pay. Edmund knelt, unarmed, defenceless, blood on his face from a minor wound, tears streaming down his cheeks. He was 17, looked younger, looked like the boy he was rather than the warrior he'd pretended to be. "Please," Edmund begged, my father, please, I'm sorry, please." Clifford wasn't interested in please, wasn't interested in mercy. He thought about his own father, cut down at St Albans by York's men, left to die in the street while York proclaimed his loyalty to the king. "Your father killed mine," Clifford said. His voice was cold, flat. "By God's blood thy father slew mine, and so will I do thee, and all thy kin." And then he stabbed Edmund, not once, multiple times. While the boy screamed, while Edmund begged, while he called for his mother, his father, for God, for anyone to save him. Clifford stabbed until Edmund stopped moving, stopped screaming, stopped being anything but a body on a bridge. He left Edmund there, left him for whoever found him to deal with. Another York dead, another traitor punished, another step towards securing Lancaster's victory. Margaret gathered her army, swollen with northern soldiers, Scottish mercenaries, and men who'd fought at Wakefield, and marched south toward London. Toward total victory. York was dead. His heir Edmund was dead. His lands were forfeit. His cause was broken. The war should have been over. But Edward of York, now the new Duke of York, the heir to his father's cause and his father's claim, was alive. And he'd just heard about Wakefield, about the paper crown, about his brother murdered on a bridge. And Edward got angry. Not hot anger, not the kind that makes you scream and throw things. Cold anger, calculating anger, the kind that doesn't forgive, doesn't forget, the kind that waits for the perfect moment, and then destroys so completely, there's nothing left to destroy. Edward of York was about to become Lancaster's worst nightmare. Edward of York was 18 when his father died, when someone brought him the news. "Your Grace," because he was the Duke now, inherited the title the moment his father's heart stopped beating. There's been a battle at Wakefield, the king's forces, and the messenger couldn't continue, couldn't find words for what had happened. Edward made him say it anyway, made him describe every detail, the battle, the slaughter, his father's death, his brother Edmund murdered on a bridge while begging for mercy, the head on a spike, the paper crown, everything. By the time the messenger finished, Edward's face was stone. No tears, no screaming, just cold, focused rage. Most 18-year-olds would have collapsed, would have fled to France, would have negotiated surrender, given up the claim, promised to leave England forever, begged for their lives. Edward did something else. He gathered every man loyal to York, every soldier who'd served his father, every lord who believed in the cause, and he made them a promise. My father tried to work within the system, tried to use Parliament, tried to compromise. They put his head on a spike with a paper crown. My brother was 17. Unarmed, they murdered him anyway. So here's what we're going to do. We're going to kill every single Lancastrian we can find. We're going to destroy their armies, execute their lords, and we're going to take the throne. Not through negotiation, through blood. And we won't stop until every one of them is dead or in exile. No mercy, no quarter, no compromise. We end this. The men cheered, because they'd been waiting for this, waiting for someone who understood that this wasn't politics anymore. This was war, the kind that ends with one side completely destroyed. February 2nd, 1461, Mortimer's Cross. Edward met a Lancastrian army under Jasper Tudor, Margaret's ally, uncle to the future Henry VII, in Wales. The Lancastrians probably expected the usual. Two armies meet, fight. Winner claims the field. Loser retreats. Standard medieval warfare. They didn't get standard warfare. They got Edward. The battle was fierce. Men died in droves, but when it was over, when the Lancastrian forces broke and fled, Edward didn't let them go. He pursued, hunted down fleeing soldiers, captured the Lancastrian leaders, and executed them, all of them, in the town square, public executions. Men beheaded while crowds watched. Edward wanted everyone to know, this is what happens to Lancaster's supporters now. This is what happens when you fight against York. But while Edward was winning in Wales, Margaret was marching south with the army that had destroyed York at Wakefield. And that army was terrifying. Not a disciplined force, not professional soldiers following orders. A horde. Northern soldiers who'd been promised plunder. Scottish mercenaries who'd been told they could keep whatever English land they took. Desperate Lancastrians who knew this was their last chance. They swept through the Midlands, looted towns, burned villages, took whatever they wanted. This wasn't an army protecting their king. This was an invasion. A wave of violence moving south. And London panicked, because Margaret's reputation had grown monstrous. The she-wolf of France, the warrior queen who put York's head on a spike, who'd let her soldiers murder a 17-year-old boy. If she reached London with that undisciplined horde, who knew what would happen? The city might burn. The nobles might be executed. Everything might fall apart. The Yorkist forces assembled north of London to stop her. The Earl of Warwick commanded them, Richard Neville, the man who'd helped York rise to power, who'd fought at St Albans, who was determined to finish what York had started. And they still had Henry VI, the king, their prisoner, their legitimising token, their ace, because as long as they had the king, they could claim they were acting in his name. February 17th, 1461, Second Battle of St Albans. Same town as the first battle 6 years earlier. Same streets, same houses, different nightmare. Margaret's forces attacked, and despite being outnumbered, despite facing a larger, better positioned army, they won. They tore through Warwick's lines, scattered the Yorkists, recaptured the king. Henry was found sitting under a tree, again. Apparently, he had a thing for trees. Battles would rage around him, and he'd just find a comfortable spot and wait for it to be over. Sometimes singing hymns, sometimes praying, completely disconnected from the violence. Margaret's soldiers brought him to her, and for the first time in months, the king and queen were reunited. Henry looked at her, blinked, smiled that gentle, disconnected smile. "Margaret, you're well. I've been praying for you, for our son. Where is Edward? I should like to see him." Margaret wanted to scream, wanted to shake him, wanted to make him understand that they were fighting a war, that York was trying to steal his throne, that their son's inheritance was at stake, but Henry wasn't capable of understanding. So she just held his hand and told him everything would be fine. Margaret had won. She had Henry. She had an army. London was 20 miles away. She could march on the capital, crown her son, execute the Yorkist leaders, end this. But she hesitated, because her army was running out of supplies, because the northern lords wanted to go home, because the Scottish mercenaries were getting restless, and London had locked its gates and sent messages saying they'd defend the city if she tried to force entry. So Margaret made a decision. She retreated, pulled back north, decided to consolidate her position, raise more money, secure her supply lines, come back stronger. It was rational, strategic, the decision any military commander would make in her position. It was also the worst mistake of her life, because it gave Edward of York exactly the opening he needed. Edward entered London on February 26, 1461. The city opened its gates to him, celebrated. Because Edward was everything Margaret wasn't. Young, just 18, but looking older, looking like a man rather than a boy. English, not French, not foreign, not suspicious. Male, not a woman trying to rule, not a queen overstepping her bounds. Charming. He smiled. He joked with soldiers. He made people feel like he was one of them despite being a duke. And Edward didn't waste time, didn't play politics, didn't negotiate or compromise or try to work within the system. On March 4th, 1461, just 6 days after entering London, he had himself proclaimed King Edward IV. Not regent, not Lord Protector, not heir presumptive. King. He didn't wait for Henry to die, didn't try to work through Parliament's Act of Accord, just took the throne, declared Henry's reign invalid, claimed the crown by right of blood and conquest. It was unprecedented, shocking, a direct challenge to everything the medieval system was built on. You couldn't just declare yourself king. Kingship was sacred, anointed, recognised by God and church and custom. You inherited it, you didn't just take it, but Edward did, and England, exhausted and desperate for strong leadership, accepted it. Because Edward looked like a king, acted like a king, made people believe he was the answer to decades of chaos. Henry VI could barely function. Margaret was a foreign woman. Edward was young, strong, English, confident. He looked like the solution. England now had two kings. Henry VI, the anointed monarch, held by Margaret's forces in the north, and Edward IV, the self-proclaimed king, holding London and the south. One crowned by God, one crowned by soldiers and popular acclaim, and everyone knew this could only end one way. One of them was going to die, and whichever one died, his cause would die with him. This was the final confrontation. Winner takes England, loser gets buried in a mass grave and forgotten by history. The armies began marching toward each other. Margaret from the north, with her Lancastrian forces, Edward from the south, with his Yorkist army. Both sides knew. This was it, the final battle, the one that would decide everything. They met at a place called Towton, a field in Yorkshire, near a small village that would become synonymous with the bloodiest day in English history. March 29th, 1461, Palm Sunday, the day before Easter, a holy day, a day of peace and reflection and preparation for Christ's resurrection, and 60,000 men were about to turn it into hell. Palm Sunday 1461, a field near Towton in Yorkshire. It's snowing, has been since dawn. Heavy, wet snow that soaks through everything. The kind that cuts visibility to almost nothing. That turns the world white and makes you lose your sense of direction. Both armies are exhausted. They've been marching for days, through mud, through rain, through snow. Men's boots are falling apart. Their feet are bleeding. Some have wrapped rags around their feet because their boots are completely gone. They're cold. So cold their fingers barely work inside their gloves. So cold they can't feel their toes. So cold they're shivering uncontrollably in their armour. This is going to be the biggest battle ever fought on English soil. Somewhere between 40 and 60,000 men, nobody knows the exact number, are about to kill each other in a snowstorm. More soldiers than fought at Agincourt. More soldiers than England could afford to lose. An entire generation of fighting men about to be slaughtered in a single afternoon. Imagine being a common soldier. You're from Lincolnshire. You farm barley. You have a wife, Alice, her name is Alice, and 2 children, a boy and a girl. You don't care about bloodlines. Don't understand the complicated politics of who should be king. You're here because your lord commanded it. Because refusing meant losing your farm. Because this is just what happens when nobles decide to fight. You're standing in formation, pike in your hands. The wind is blowing straight into your face, into the Lancastrian lines. The snow is so thick you can barely see the men next to you. Can't see the enemy at all. Just white everywhere, white and cold, and the sound of wind howling. Someone next to you is praying, loud. Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. His voice is shaking. You want to tell him to shut up, that his praying is making it worse, making everyone more nervous. But you're praying too, in your head. Please God, please let me survive. Please let me see Alice again. Please let me hold my children. Please. The Yorkist archers fire first. You can't see them, but you hear it. That sound, like wind through reeds, but sharper, more menacing. Thousands of arrows in flight, and they're flying further than normal because of the wind. Because the wind is behind them, pushing them toward you. The Lancastrian archers fire back, into the wind. Their arrows fall short. Drop into the mud, wasted. The commander is screaming orders. Advance, close the distance. So you march forward, through the snow, through the wind, and the arrows keep coming. The man next to you, the one who was praying, takes an arrow through his throat. He doesn't die immediately, just falls, hands clutching at the arrow, trying to pull it out, but it's stuck. He's making this sound, this wet, gurgling sound. You want to help him, want to stop, but you can't. You have to keep moving, because stopping means dying. More arrows, more men falling. You're walking on bodies now, stepping over people you knew, people from your village. That's Thomas, he owed you money. That's John, his wife makes good bread. They're dead now, or dying. Doesn't matter which. You keep walking, and then the lines collide, and suddenly you can't see anything. Can't breathe properly. Men packed so tight you can't swing your weapon. Just shoving, stabbing, whatever you can reach. You jab your pike at something, hit armour, jab again, again. Something gives, someone screams. You pull back, jab at something else. Someone grabs you, you panic, spin. It's a Yorkist soldier, face covered in blood. His or someone else's, can't tell. He's trying to stab you with a dagger. You drop your pike. Can't use it at this distance. You grab his wrist. He grabs yours. You're grappling, pushing, both trying to stab the other, both slipping in blood and snow. His breath is hot on your face. Smells like ale and fear. You see his eyes. He's terrified. Just as terrified as you. And then someone else stabs him from behind. He goes limp, falls. You never saw who killed him. Don't care. You pick up your pike, keep fighting, because there's nothing else to do. The battle lasts all day, from dawn until well after dark. Hours of this, hours of men dying inches from you. The snow isn't white anymore. It's red, brown, black with mud and blood and the contents of split stomachs. Men's intestines are spilling out. Men are screaming for their mothers, for their wives, for God to end their suffering. You slip, fall into something soft. It's a body, or part of a body. The face is gone, smashed in by a mace or axe. You don't know who it was. You scramble up. Your hands are covered in blood. Someone else's blood. It's warm. Steam rising from it in the cold air. You're going to be sick, but you can't be sick. Have to keep fighting. Late afternoon. You're exhausted. Can barely lift your weapon. Every muscle aches. Your lungs burn from breathing cold air. And then fresh troops arrive. Yorkist reinforcements, thousands of them, hitting the Lancastrian flank. That's it. That's the moment you've been dreading. The line breaks. Men start running, fleeing through the snow, through the dark. You run too, because staying means dying. You're not a coward. You fought all day, but the battle is lost and you want to live. Want to see Alice again. Want to hold your children. But the Yorkists pursue, cut down fleeing men. No mercy, no quarter. You see men killed while trying to surrender. See men drown trying to cross rivers in armour. See men cut down from behind while running. You keep running, lungs burning, legs cramping, praying you'll make it, praying the Yorkists won't catch you, praying for just one more day, one more chance. 28,000 men died that day. Some estimates say more. In one afternoon, in a snowstorm, in a field that would be haunted for centuries. The snow had run red. Streams literally stopped flowing because bodies blocked them. The River Cock became known as the River of Blood. England lost an entire generation. Fathers and sons, brothers, cousins, all gone, frozen in the mud, stripped by scavengers, left to rot. The War of the Roses had just claimed more English lives in a single day than any battle before or since. The House of Lancaster had been destroyed, their armies scattered, their cause broken, and Margaret, she fled with her son and the king, ran to Scotland, to safety, to exile, because there was nothing left to fight with. No army, no money, no hope. They'd lost completely, catastrophically, and there was no coming back from Towton, no rebuilding, no second chance. Lancaster was done. Finished, Edward IV controlled England, and the House of Lancaster hunted fugitives, exiles in a foreign kingdom, a dynasty that had ruled England for 3 generations, reduced to a queen, a mad king, and a 10-year-old prince hiding in Scotland and hoping for a miracle. They'd lost everything, but Margaret of Anjou had never given up on anything in her life, and she wasn't starting now. Scotland, 1461, summer, but you wouldn't know it from the cold. Margaret stands in a draughty stone castle that smells like peat smoke and desperation. Everything smells like smoke here. The Scots burn peat because they don't have enough wood. It makes this acrid smell that gets into your clothes, your hair, your lungs. She has Henry, who's barely present most days, who sits by the fire and prays and sometimes forgets where he is, who occasionally asks when they're going home, who doesn't seem to understand that home is gone, that England belongs to York now, that they're refugees living on foreign charity. She has Edward, her 11-year-old son. The boy has grown thin. The Scottish food doesn't agree with him. Or maybe it's the stress. Maybe it's watching his mother become increasingly desperate, increasingly worn. Edward practices with a sword every day, training for a war that might never come, for a throne he might never claim. He's serious. Too serious for 11. Never smiles anymore. And Margaret has nothing else. No money, no army, no kingdom. England belongs to Edward IV now. The whole country. York has won. And Margaret? She's just another deposed queen living on foreign charity. It's humiliating. She negotiates with the Scots, trades away English border territories, gives away parts of her own kingdom in exchange for soldiers. It makes her sick, literally sick. She vomits after signing the treaty, because she's just sold English land to foreigners, because she had no choice, because she needs an army, and this is the only way to get one. And in 1462, she gets what she needs: Scottish soldiers. Enough to mount an invasion. She and her small Lancastrian force march south, take several northern castles, raise the Red Rose banner, proclaim that King Henry VI has returned, that Lancaster will reclaim the throne, that York's reign is illegitimate. Edward IV responds immediately, marches north with an overwhelming force, and Margaret's borrowed army takes one look at the Yorkist numbers and retreats. The Scots go home, the castles fall. By the end of 1462, Margaret is fleeing again, this time not just to Scotland, but to France, to her cousin, King Louis XI, begging for help. She leaves Henry behind, has to. He's too unstable, too easily captured, too much of a liability. She hides him with loyal supporters in northern England, secret sympathisers who risk execution by sheltering the deposed king. And Margaret takes her son to France. King Louis listens to her plea, considers, and agrees to provide limited support. Not because he cares about Lancaster's cause, not because he believes Henry has the better claim, but because keeping England unstable serves French interests. A divided England is a weak England. An England at war with itself can't threaten France. So Louis gives Margaret just enough support to be a nuisance, just enough money to raise small forces, just enough encouragement to keep fighting, but never enough to actually win, because if Lancaster won decisively, England would be stable again, and stable England was dangerous. Margaret spends the next 3 years in France, planning, negotiating, raising small forces for raids that accomplish nothing, watching her son grow up in exile, teaching him about the throne that should be his, the kingdom that was stolen, the cause he'll fight for someday. Edward of Westminster is growing into a serious boy, intense, focused, angry. He listens to his mother's stories and absorbs every lesson. He learns to hate York with everything he has, learns that compromise is weakness, that mercy is failure, that the only way to reclaim his inheritance is through blood. He's 13, 14, 15, growing tall, learning to fight, practicing daily with soldiers his mother has hired. He's good. Natural talent combined with desperate determination. He fights like every practice session is real. Like the wooden swords are steel. Like he's actually killing Yorkists rather than just training. And then, in 1465 comes the final humiliation. Word reaches France. Henry VI has been captured. Someone betrayed his location. Someone talked. Maybe they were tortured. Maybe they were bribed. Maybe they just got tired of risking execution to hide a king who wasn't really a king anymore. Yorkist soldiers found him in northern England, captured him, brought him to London. They didn't kill him. Edward IV wasn't that stupid. Henry was more valuable alive, a captive king. Proof that the Lancastrian cause was dead. Proof that Edward's reign was legitimate and secure. They paraded Henry through London streets, humiliated him publicly, then locked him in the Tower. Margaret hears the news in France, and for the first time, she wonders if God has abandoned her, if this is punishment for her pride, for refusing to accept defeat, for dragging England through years of war. Her husband is a prisoner. Her son is stateless. Her cause is dead. And Edward IV rules England like he was always meant to. She should give up, should accept that Edward of Westminster will never be king, that the House of Lancaster is finished, that York has won, but she doesn't. Because giving up would mean admitting York was right. That might makes right. That crowns belong to whoever can take them. She can't accept that, won't accept that. So she waits, plots, hopes for a miracle, any opportunity, some crack in Edward IV's power that she could exploit. And in 1469, impossibly, she gets one. From the last person anyone expected. Richard Neville, Earl of Warwick, the kingmaker. The man who'd put Edward IV on the throne. Edward's most powerful supporter, his mentor, his ally. Warwick switched sides. Richard Neville, Earl of Warwick, was the most powerful man in England. More powerful than most kings. He'd made Edward IV, put him on the throne, provided the armies and political support that turned an 18-year-old duke into King of England. And Edward had rewarded him, given him titles, estates, power, made him the second most important man in the kingdom. Warwick had governed alongside Edward, advised him, expected to control him. Because Warwick had him there, surely that meant Edward owed him everything. But Edward didn't like being controlled, didn't like being told what to do. He was king. He made the decisions. And when Warwick tried to arrange a prestigious foreign marriage for him, a French princess, politically advantageous, cementing alliances, Edward refused, because Edward had already married someone else, in secret, without telling Warwick, without consulting anyone. He'd married Elizabeth Woodville, a widow, a commoner, a woman with no political value, someone who brought nothing to the marriage except herself. Warwick was furious, humiliated. He'd been in France negotiating this marriage, promising the French that Edward would marry their princess, making agreements, and now he looked like a fool, like he didn't actually control the young king he'd made. It got worse. Elizabeth Woodville had a large family, brothers, sisters, parents, and she wanted them elevated, wanted them to marry into noble families, wanted them to hold important positions, and Edward, besotted with his beautiful wife, agreed. Gave her family titles, arranged marriages, handed out positions of power. The old nobility, Warwick included, watched in horror as these Woodvilles, these upstarts with no royal blood, married their way into every corner of influence. It was the Woodville invasion all over again, just like with Margaret of Anjou, just like Lancaster. And Warwick had helped destroy Lancaster only to watch Edward repeat their mistakes. Warwick tried to rebel. Twice, in 1469 and 1470, he raised forces against Edward, tried to capture him, control him, make him get rid of the Woodvilles. Both times failed. And in 1470, Warwick fled to France, disgraced, desperate, his political career in ruins. And there in the French court he met Margaret of Anjou. They hated each other, absolutely loathed each other. Warwick had fought for York, had helped destroy Lancaster, had killed Lancastrians at Towton. Margaret had never forgotten, never forgiven. She called him a traitor, a turncoat, a man without honour or loyalty. But King Louis of France saw an opportunity. He forced them to negotiate, locked them in rooms together until they worked out a deal, made them swallow their hatred and make an agreement that neither wanted but both needed. Warwick would invade England, restore Henry VI to the throne. In exchange, Edward of Westminster would marry Warwick's daughter, Anne Neville. The two causes, Warwick's revenge and Lancaster's legitimacy, tied together. Margaret agreed, because what choice did she have? This was her only chance, her last chance, to restore Henry, to secure her son's succession, to destroy York. She swallowed her pride, shook Warwick's hand, started planning an invasion, but she made one careful decision. She would stay in France, with her son, until Warwick proved he could actually win, until England was secure, until Henry was freed and Edward IV was defeated. She wasn't risking Edward's life on Warwick's promises, not until she was certain it was safe. That decision saved Edward of Westminster's life and cost her everything else. September 1470. Warwick landed in England, and everything went perfectly. Edward IV was caught completely off guard, unprepared. His supporters scattered. Warwick's forces swept through the country meeting, almost no resistance. By October, Edward IV was fleeing, running to the coast, escaping to Burgundy, and Warwick was entering London in triumph. He went straight to the Tower, found Henry VI, who'd been locked up for 5 years, living in comfortable rooms, but still a prisoner, still isolated from the world. Warwick brought him out, cleaned him up, dressed him in royal robes, paraded him through London as the rightful king, restored to his throne. The Readeption, they called it. Henry VI's second reign. And for a few months, it worked. Lancaster was back. Henry wore the crown. Edward IV was in exile. Everything Margaret had fought for had been achieved. Except Henry was still mad, still barely functional. 5 years in the Tower hadn't helped. He'd gotten worse, more disconnected, more fragile. He sat through council meetings staring at nothing. Sometimes didn't recognise where he was or why he was wearing a crown. When presented with papers to sign, he'd just sign them without reading, without asking what they were. Warwick governed in Henry's name, tried to build stable government, tried to win support from nobles who'd served Edward, tried to prove Lancaster could rule effectively, but everyone knew it was a sham. Henry was a puppet, Warwick pulled the strings, and the English nobility, exhausted by decades of war, wasn't thrilled about either of them. Margaret finally sailed for England in March 1471, brought her son, prepared to join Warwick, to secure the victory, to finally, after 10 years of exile and humiliation, reclaim what was rightfully theirs. She landed on the English coast, took her first steps on English soil in a decade, breathed English air, touched English earth, and she arrived just in time to watch everything collapse. Edward IV had returned, landed in England in March with a small force, and just like in 1460, just like always, Edward proved he was the most dangerous man in England. He gathered supporters as he marched. Lords who'd served him rejoined. Towns opened their gates. By April, Edward had an army, and he marched straight at Warwick. April 14th, 1471. Barnet, just north of London, thick fog, the kind where you can barely see 10 feet ahead. Neither army could see the other clearly. Units got confused. Lancastrians fought Lancastrians by mistake. Yorkists killed Yorkists. Pure chaos in the fog. And somewhere in that chaos, Richard Neville, Earl of Warwick, died. The kingmaker. The man who'd made and unmade kings. Cut down trying to reach his horse. Killed by soldiers who probably didn't even know who they were stabbing. His body was displayed in London afterward. Stripped, laid out so everyone could see. Proof that he was dead. That the man who'd switched sides so many times had finally run out of sides to switch to. Margaret heard about Barnet while marching north with her forces, heard that Warwick was dead, that his army was destroyed, that Edward IV controlled London again, that Henry was back in the Tower, that everything they'd won in 1470 was already lost. She'd been in England less than 3 weeks, and the Readeption was over. Most people would have surrendered, would have begged Edward for mercy, would have taken their son back to France, promised never to return, anything to avoid another battle. But Margaret wasn't most people. She gathered the remaining Lancastrian forces, every lord still loyal to Henry, every soldier still willing to fight for the Red Rose. Marched toward Wales, hoped to raise more troops there, build an army, keep fighting, Edward pursued, because he knew this was the end. One way or another, if Margaret escaped to Wales, the war would drag on for years. But if he caught her, if he destroyed her army, killed or captured her son, then it was over. Lancaster would have no heir, no future, no hope. He marched his army day and night, pushed them until they dropped. Because he had to catch Margaret before she reached Wales. May 4th, 1471, Tewkesbury, a meadow by the River Severn. This was it. The final battle, winner takes England, loser loses everything. May 4th, 1471, the meadows near Tewkesbury. Warm, sunny, beautiful spring day, the kind of day where you should be planting crops or courting girls, or doing anything except preparing to die. Margaret's forces are exhausted. They've been force marching for days, trying to reach Wales, trying to escape Edward's pursuit, but Edward caught them. His army blocking their path. No escape now, no retreat. They have to fight. This is it. The final Lancastrian stand. Edward of Westminster is 17 years old. He spent his childhood in exile, listening to his mother's stories, training for this moment, for the day he'd fight for his birthright, for the throne that should be his. He's wearing armour that's too big. Hand-me-down plate from some French lord. It doesn't fit properly. Chafes, but it's what they have. Margaret begs him not to fight in the front lines, to stay back, to stay safe, to survive. Edward, please, you're the heir, you're all we have. If you die... But Edward isn't listening. He's 17, brave, stupid, desperate to prove himself, to show he's not his father, to prove he can be the warrior King Lancaster needs. I'm going to fight, Mother. I'm going to kill Yorkists, and then I'm going to take my throne. His voice is breaking slightly, still has that teenage quality. Not quite a man's voice yet, but trying hard to sound confident, trying hard to sound like a king. Edward, I'm fighting. And he walks away, toward the front, in lines toward his death. Margaret watches him go, wants to run after him, drag him back, lock him away somewhere safe. But she can't. He's the Prince of Wales, the heir to the throne. He has to fight. Has to be seen fighting. Has to prove Lancaster isn't finished. But God, she's terrified. Because if he dies, it's over. Everything she's fought for. Everything she's sacrificed. 20 years of war and exile and humiliation. All for nothing. The Battle of Tewkesbury starts mid-morning. The Lancastrians are outnumbered, outpositioned, exhausted, but they fight desperately. Because they know if they lose, it's over. No retreat, no exile, no second chances. Edward IV has made it clear. No mercy, no quarter. This ends today. Edward of Westminster is at the front, fighting. Actually fighting, not just watching from a safe distance. He's good. His training shows. He cuts down a Yorkist soldier, then another. He's screaming. Rage and fear mixed together. Sounds like a boy trying to be a man. But he's surrounded by veterans. Men who've fought at Towton, who've survived a dozen battles, who know how to kill efficiently. A Yorkist soldier sees the rich armour, realises this isn't a common fighter, calls to others. They converge, targeting the boy in the expensive armour. Edward of Westminster fights, desperately, his sword swinging, but he's 17, exhausted, overwhelmed. Someone strikes his helmet, dents it. The impact stuns him. He staggers. Someone else hits his leg. He goes down. And then they're on him. Multiple soldiers, all striking. Edward tries to rise. Can't. His armour is good, but not good enough. Blades find gaps, joints, weak points. Edward is screaming. Not words, just sound, raw terror. And then he's not screaming anymore. Then he's still. Edward of Westminster, Prince of Wales, last legitimate heir to the House of Lancaster, dies in a meadow near Tewkesbury. 17 years old, his blood soaking into English soil. His body trampled as the battle continues around him. The Battle of Tewkesbury becomes a slaughter. The Lancastrian line breaks. Men flee, run for the nearby abbey, hoping for sanctuary. But Edward IV's soldiers pursue. Drag men out of the church, kill them in the churchyard. This isn't war anymore. This is extermination. Margaret is captured after the battle, found hiding near the battlefield, brought before Edward IV. She's covered in dust. Her hair has come loose from its pins. She looks old, exhausted, broken. All the fight has gone out of her. "Where is my son?" she asks. Her voice is hoarse. "Where is Edward? I need to see him. Please, I need..." Edward IV just looks at her, and she understands, sees it in his eyes. Edward of Westminster is dead. Her son is dead. Her only child, the boy she fought for, protected, raised in exile, trained to be king, dead at 17 in a battle that never should have happened. She doesn't scream, doesn't cry, doesn't collapse, just stands there, silent. Because what is there to say? What is there to do? Everything is gone, everything. Her husband is a prisoner, her son is dead, her cause is destroyed. 20 years of fighting for nothing. Edward IV could have executed her, could have ended the Lancastrian line completely, but he doesn't. Maybe he feels some mercy. Maybe he thinks a captured queen is better propaganda than a martyred one. Maybe he just doesn't want to kill a woman who's lost everything. He imprisons her, keeps her in the tower, lets her live. But she's not a queen anymore. Not a political force, not a threat, just a French woman who spent 20 years fighting for a lost cause, who sacrificed everything and failed. May 21st, 1471, 2 weeks after Tewkesbury, Henry VI dies in the Tower of London. Officially, he died of melancholy, grief over his son's death, natural causes. Unofficially, everyone knows he was murdered, probably by Edward's orders, possibly by Edward's brother, Richard of Gloucester. They killed him quietly, probably smothered him with a pillow, made it look peaceful. His body was displayed at St. Paul's Cathedral, so people could see he was really dead, so the Lancastrian cause could finally be buried with its king. The House of Lancaster is extinct. Henry VI, dead. Edward of Westminster, dead. The male line ended. The red rose, crushed. Edward IV has won. Completely. Permanently. The wars of the roses are over. York has triumphed, and Lancaster, erased from history. A failed dynasty that had ruled England for 3 generations and ended with a mad king and a murdered prince. Except it's not over, because there's one more Lancaster, one last hope, a 14-year-old boy in Brittany named Henry Tudor. Margaret Beaufort was different from Margaret of Anjou. She didn't lead armies, didn't fight battles, didn't make dramatic gestures or passionate speeches. Margaret Beaufort was quiet, patient, calculating. The kind of woman who understood that power came from information, from alliances, from appearing harmless while slowly, carefully, building networks of support. Margaret had given birth to Henry Tudor when she was 13. 13. A child giving birth to a child. She'd been separated from him for most of his life. He'd grown up in Wales, then in Brittany, then in France. She'd seen him maybe a dozen times in 28 years, but he was her son. And with the male Lancaster line extinct, Henry had a claim. Through his mother, through the Beaufort line, descended from John of Gaunt and his mistress Catherine Swynford. Legitimised by Parliament, but with a clause excluding them from royal succession. A questionable claim, a weak claim, but a claim nonetheless. And Margaret Beaufort, like Margaret of Anjou before her, was not a woman who gave up. She'd survived decades of political chaos by being careful, by never being too visible, too threatening, by appearing loyal to whoever held power while quietly working against them. She'd married multiple times, always to powerful men, always positioning herself, building influence, accumulating favours, waiting, and now she had a goal: put her son on the throne. Restore the House of Lancaster through the Tudors. Destroy the House of York. She just had to wait for the right moment. That moment came in 1483. Edward IV died, suddenly, at age 40, probably from pneumonia or stroke or some other illness that medieval medicine couldn't treat. He'd ruled England for 22 years, built stability, crushed Lancaster, secured his dynasty. He had 2 sons, Edward V and Richard of York, 2 male heirs. The succession should have been secure. Edward V was 12, old enough to be crowned, young enough to need a regent, but the regency should have been straightforward. But Edward's brother, Richard of Gloucester, had other plans. Richard was ambitious, capable, had served Edward loyally for years, been his right hand, his enforcer, and now he looked at his 12-year-old nephew and saw an opportunity. Richard seized power, moved fast, captured the young Edward V before he could be crowned, declared Edward's marriage to Elizabeth Woodville invalid, claimed Edward had been pre-contracted to another woman, making all his children illegitimate, bastards, unable to inherit. It was the Act of Accord in reverse, York doing to itself what York had done to Lancaster, disinheriting the legitimate heir, claiming the throne through legal technicalities and force, Richard had himself crowned Richard III, and the young princes, Edward V and Richard of York, disappeared into the Tower, most likely murdered, probably smothered in their beds. 2 boys, 12 and 9 years old, killed so their uncle could wear the crown. York turning on itself, devouring its own children. The same family that destroyed Lancaster was now destroying its own heirs. Margaret Beaufort watched all this and saw her opportunity, because Richard III was vulnerable. He'd taken the throne through betrayal and probable murder. Half the kingdom hated him, the other half didn't trust him, and he had no strong heir, no obvious successor. His position was shaky, fragile. Margaret started plotting immediately, contacted nobles who hated Richard, built alliances, sent messages to her son in Brittany, told him it was time to claim the throne, time to invade, time to restore Lancaster. But Margaret knew her son's claim was weak. Tudor blood wasn't enough. He needed legitimacy, needed to unite the Yorkist and Lancastrian factions, needed to make himself acceptable to nobles who'd fought for both sides. So Margaret made a deal with Elizabeth Woodville, Edward IV's widow, the woman whose sons Richard had probably murdered. Elizabeth hated Richard, wanted revenge, wanted her family restored, and she had a daughter, Elizabeth of York, Edward IV's eldest child. Undeniable Yorkist blood. Margaret proposed a marriage. Henry Tudor would marry Elizabeth of York. Last Lancaster heir marries the Yorkist princess. Red rose and white rose, united. It was politically brilliant, and it gave Henry something he desperately needed: legitimacy, support from Yorkists who hated Richard but couldn't stomach a pure Lancastrian claim. The deal was made. The invasion was planned. In August 1485, Henry Tudor landed in Wales with a small army, French mercenaries, English exiles, Welsh supporters, and started marching toward Richard III, toward the final confrontation, toward the battle that would end the Wars of the Roses. Henry Tudor was 28 years old. He'd spent 14 years in exile, Brittany, France, different courts, different languages. He barely remembered England, had never fought in a major battle, had no experience governing, no charisma like Edward IV, no military genius like Edward of Westminster might have become. He was just a man with a complicated claim, backed by his mother's plotting and French money. But he was Lancaster's last hope, the final heir, the Red Rose's last gamble. He marched through Wales gathering supporters, Welsh lords who remembered old alliances, men who hated Richard, opportunists who wanted to be on the winning side. His army grew, not massive, not overwhelming, but enough to force Richard to respond, enough to make this a real fight. August 22nd, 1485, near Market Bosworth in Leicestershire. The two armies met. This was it, the final battle of the Wars of the Roses. Though no one knew that yet. Richard III commanded the larger army, had better position, should have won. He was an experienced warrior, had fought at Barnet, at Tewkesbury, knew how to command, how to inspire, how to win. But Richard had a problem. Several powerful nobles, including the Stanley family, related to Margaret Beaufort by marriage, were on the battlefield but hadn't committed to either side. They waited on nearby hills, watched, tried to figure out who was going to win before they picked a side. Classic medieval politics. Don't commit until you know which side will win. Richard needed them, needed their troops, needed their support, but they wouldn't move. The battle started. Richard's forces pushed forward, nearly broke Henry's lines. This could have been over in an hour. Another Lancastrian defeat, another failed invasion, another Tudor body buried in an unmarked grave. Henry Tudor, the boy who lived in exile, killed in his first real battle. But Richard made a choice, the same choice his mentor, the old Duke of York, had made at Wakefield 25 years earlier. He saw Henry across the battlefield, saw his chance to end this personally. to kill the Tudor pretender himself, to prove his strength, his legitimacy, his right to rule. Richard charged, with his household knights, straight at Henry, through enemy lines. It was brave, dramatic, the kind of thing that makes for great stories. A king personally fighting, risking everything, leading from the front, but it was also incredibly stupid, because Richard isolated himself, left his main force behind, charged into enemy lines with only a small group of knights, and the Stanleys, watching from their hill, finally made their choice. They attacked Richard, fell on him from the side, surrounded him. Richard of Gloucester, King Richard III, died fighting. Surrounded by enemies, struck down in the chaos, his helmet knocked off, his horse killed under him, his bodyguards slaughtered. Someone split his skull with a halberd. Another blow crushed his skull. Richard fell, dead. The last York king killed in a field in the Midlands. His crown, the one he'd stolen from his nephews, fell off during the fight. Rolled into a thorn bush, someone found it, picked it up, carried it to Lord Stanley, and Stanley, Margaret Beaufort's husband, placed it on Henry Tudor's head. Right there, on the battlefield, while Richard's body was still warm, while Richard's blood was still soaking into the ground. Henry Tudor became King Henry VII, not because Parliament proclaimed him, not because of elaborate ceremony, but because he'd won a battle and someone put a crown on his head. That's how kingship worked in 1485, not divine right, not bloodlines, power, victory, survival. Richard's body was stripped, slung over a horse, displayed in Leicester to prove he was dead, then buried quickly in a church. No ceremony, no respect, just a dead king in the ground. The House of York was destroyed. Edward IV's sons murdered. Edward IV's brother killed at Bosworth. The male York line extinct. And Henry Tudor. He had to move fast, secure his position, make sure no one questioned his claim. He married Elizabeth of York in January 1486, united the Roses. Red and white finally joined. Their first son Arthur was born 9 months later. The Tudor line had begun. The Wars of the Roses were over. 30 years of civil war. 30 years of battles and executions and murdered princes. Finally finished, Lancaster had won. Not cleanly, not directly. Through a questionable claim and a mother's plotting, and a battlefield where the right nobles switched sides at the right moment. But they won. The Red Rose survived, and the House of Tudor, built on Lancastrian blood and Yorkist legitimacy, would rule England for over a century. Margaret of Anjou never saw this. She died in 1482, still a prisoner, ransomed to France, lived her final years in poverty. The woman who led armies died alone, never knowing that Lancaster would eventually triumph. But Margaret Beaufort lived, saw her son crowned, saw him marry Elizabeth of York, saw him secure the throne. She became the king's mother. Lady Margaret, one of the most powerful women in England, and she made sure everyone knew it, made sure everyone remembered that without her plotting, her patience, her careful manipulation, Henry would never have been king. She'd done what Margaret of Anjou couldn't, restored Lancaster, not through armies, through intelligence, through waiting for the perfect moment, through understanding that sometimes the best way to fight is to appear not to fight at all. Henry VII ruled England for 24 years, died peacefully in his bed in 1509, passed the throne to his son Henry VIII, founded a dynasty that would rule England for over a century. The Tudors claimed to have united York and Lancaster, ended the Civil War, brought peace and stability, and they had. But that peace came at a cost. The Wars of the Roses killed somewhere between 50 and 100,000 people, maybe more. Nobody kept accurate counts, destroyed multiple noble families, turned England into a killing ground where cousins murdered cousins, where kings were deposed and murdered, where princes died as teenagers, where queens led armies and watched their sons killed. Lancaster won, eventually, But look at what it cost. Henry VI murdered. Edward of Westminster killed at 17. Margaret of Anjou died in exile. Dozens of Lancastrian nobles executed or killed in battle. Thousands of common soldiers dead in fields across England. All for what? So Henry Tudor could claim a throne he barely had a right to? But maybe that's not fair, because the alternative was worse. York winning meant Richard III ruling. A king who'd probably murdered his own nephews. A king who'd betrayed his brother's children. A king who'd shown that no oath, no family bond, no principle mattered more than power. Lancaster's victory meant legitimacy still mattered. That you couldn't just murder your way to the throne and hold it. That betrayal would be punished. Eventually. It meant Margaret of Anjou's 20-year fight hadn't been for nothing. It meant Henry VI's suffering had meaning. It meant Edward of Westminster's death would be avenged. Not immediately, not cleanly, but eventually. The Red Rose won, through Henry Tudor, through a questionable claim and a mother's determination, and a battlefield where fortune finally favoured Lancaster. And York, Richard III, dead in the mud, Edward IV's sons murdered, the York line extinct, the White Rose crushed. That's the lesson of the Wars of the Roses from Lancaster's perspective. Not that they were perfect, not that they deserved to win, but that they refused to quit, that they kept fighting even when it looked hopeless, that they survived exile and defeat and the murder of their heirs, that they waited, plotted, endured, and when York finally destroyed itself through its own betrayals, Lancaster was still there, still fighting, still claiming the throne. One last heir, one last invasion, one last battle, and they won. Because in the Wars of the Roses, survival was victory, and Lancaster survived, barely, by the thinnest thread, through a teenager in exile and a mother's determination. But they survived, and they won. And the House of Tudor became one of the greatest dynasties in English history. So when we remember the Wars of the Roses, remember it from Lancaster's side. Remember the mad king who never wanted the throne. Remember the French queen who led armies for her son. Remember the prince who died at 17, fighting for his birthright. Remember the boy in exile who became the last hope. Remember the mothers, Margaret of Anjou and Margaret Beaufort, who refused to let their sons' claims die, who fought with everything they had, who survived when survival should have been impossible. That's the story of Lancaster. Not glory, not easy victories, but endurance, refusing to disappear, surviving the worst medieval England could throw at you, and ultimately, impossibly, winning. Because that's what Lancaster did. Lost every battle that mattered, lost their armies, lost their king, lost their heir, lost everything. And then when York had destroyed itself, Lancaster came back. One last time, took the throne back. Not because they were strongest, not because they were best, but because they refused to give up. Refused to accept that York had won. Refused to let the Red Rose die. And in the end, that was enough. Thanks for staying with me tonight. If you made it this far, drop a comment. Let me know what you think. The Wars of the Roses weren't about roses. They were about survival, about power, about families destroying each other over a crown. Lancaster paid the price, but they won, and that's what matters. The Red Rose survived. Good night. And remember, sometimes winning just means surviving long enough to watch your enemies destroy themselves.